All right, so this week, hopefully you guys are working on your Flash projects and getting those going. We're going to talk a little bit about Django this week. So the goal is that we'll do something very similar to we did with Flash. So we'll have part 1, part 2 this week, and then next week we'll do part 3, and then on the last day, next Thursday, we will cover the Django project and portion of that. So on this one, this is the only link I have out here now. I'll put some more links up here as we go. You guys still can't see the screen. Hold on. Helps if you plug it in. Just a second. Okay. So you'll have a link for the Django documentation. So what is Django? If we come back out here to the main thing, and of course my internet just changed on me. Give me a second. There we go. So Django is, the way I like to think of it is Django is more of a advanced version of what you do with Flash. That isn't entirely fair, but for the most part, if I have a real small, quick web app, I do something like Flash. If I have something more robust that demands a little bit more database and more of like an admin interface to manage whatever web application I'm doing, that kind of stuff, I jump over into Django. So Django is pretty much my default, but there's a good reason to use Flash for certain projects. So the idea behind Django is it's a high-level Python framework meant for rapid deployment, rapid development, and it's really clean and pragmatic and built by experienced developers. So when it was originally created, it was built by a newspaper. And so the example that we're going to go through is actually going to talk about building a poll survey. And the reason that is this newspaper needed to be fast and innovative and get new websites out, get little applications up and running real fast. So though they developed this free and open source platform framework. So a couple things that we want to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about models when we get there. But when you come in here and get to this get started with Django portion, and we are actually going to go through the tutorial because this is another one of those where the tutorial is extremely detailed and covers all the different facets of what you would use with Django. So back when I started with Django, it would have been almost 10 years ago now, somewhere in that realm. I went through the tutorial, got it figured out, and then I dove first into a project. And that project was significantly different than the tutorial, obviously, but it allowed you to learn all the different models and the different ways to set things up. So as far as installing it, you could go through this install guide, but realistically for what we're doing, you could simply pip install Django inside of PyCharm. The other way to do it is because we do have things like PyCharm. Let's go ahead and get PyCharm loaded up here. And while that's loading up, we're going to go into this Django application and kind of talk about it. So the way Django works is it works in kind of a twofold. You have the entire project, and you can think of this like the entire website, so to speak, right? So you have Google, for instance, right? Google's the entire domain, the entire website that it's running on. And then you have a series of applications that are standalone applications that you could put on any project. So you'll have something like a register app, and that registration part will handle all the registration for your website. You will have something like a member database, and you can have an entire member system that would allow you to edit, manage, and do that kind of stuff within your members. You may have a website portion that is one little app that fits under your domain. So when you start a project, you're going to have this all-encompassing project, and then you have a bunch of little applications that sit underneath of that. And those applications are designed to be standalone, where I can pull them out and shove them into another project. So you write them in such a way that they're not necessarily tied to your project. They may be for the purposes of you writing them, but that also means that you can take a bunch of other people's Django apps and stick them into your program for better functionality. So for example, there's Django apps out there for handling images and photos to build a photo gallery, right? You could build your own photo gallery app inside your project, but it's much easier just to snap in somebody else's app for that. Then you could customize that app to make it work for your project if you wanted to, but they have those individual apps. So with Django itself, we get PyCharm up, and if we go up here and start a new project, again, you can start out with just pure Python and start running away with Python 3.10. In this case, because we have PyCharm, we're going to go ahead and click on Django over here on the left. We go to more settings, and we're going to see a Django template engine. There's two different Django or template engines that work with Django. You can use Django, which is the one we just learned in Flask. We can also use Django templates itself. They're very similar to one another. Django has a little bit of more specific functionality. So we're going to go ahead and leave the default of Django. We'll go ahead and leave the default of our templates folder inside of here. And then you have an option for enabling Django admin. We're going to disable that for now, and we're not going to create an application. We'll kind of walk through that. So once we hit create and cancel, because I forgot to give that a name. So let's try that again. Django, we have this Django project 1. That's actually fine for what we're going to do here. So let's hit create this window. And remember, all PyCharm's doing here is creating up another virtual environment. It's going to go ahead and pip install Django for you so you get the latest version that's running out there. The latest one currently is going to be 4.4, I believe, or 4.1, I'm sorry. And inside 4.1, you will always want to come up here and look at the documentation. This documentation is extremely well written. It's very, very easy to read through. It makes a lot of sense what they're doing. Everything I learned about it was literally just reading the documentation over and over and over. It's really well written in that regard. At the top, when you start looking through this documentation, you can see that I'm on version 4.1 here. There may be instances where you need an older version. Down here in the lower right-hand corner, you're going to see document version 4.1. You can go all the way back to 1.8. So you can pick the different versions here, including the dev version if you're running the latest and greatest on top of it. All right. First steps in getting that up, as you can tell, I had to do the installation and such like that. Again, PyCharm is essentially doing that for us. So if we look at show all, we can see that it's currently installing all of those packages and then indexing everything within Django. The great part about using this inside of PyCharm is it's going to not only build all the different files out, but it's going to give you auto completion and a bunch of other nice things when you're dealing with Django itself. If you're using something like Atom or another IDE, you may have to have a Django plugin in order to get some of that functionality. All right. So this is almost done with the background task. If we take a look over here on the left-hand side, you'll see that we had a few things auto-created for us. So one is this templates folder. This is where we would deal with our HTML templates as a whole in a project, but we also have template folders that go into the specific app. So just like Flask, you know how we had a specific app called Flaskar, and then we were able to create templates and different items inside of that. The VENV, remember that itself is just a virtual environment for your Python files. We do not want to submit that up to GitHub. And then the last one here that you have is called manage. And so manage.py is one that we're going to use a lot. We actually use it from the command line side of things. And that's how we can use that for administrative tasks. For example, starting up a database, starting up the run server, starting up a bunch of things. Similar to what you used at the command line for Flask, you're going to, you did flask -- app, whatever it was, -run kind of thing, or just run. This would be similar where you're going to use Python Django, this manage.py. Okay. Couple other files that are in here that it automatically creates by default. So you're going to notice that you have the name of your project, and it's going to have an init.py in it. Does anybody remember what that is? Yes. Correct. It turns a directory into a module within Python, meaning that when we launch this project using manage.py, it's going to look directly in this project folder as part of a module and import it in directly. All right. You have a couple other files that are inside of here, and we're going to go into those in much more detail. But we have ASGI. So if you remember with Flask, it was a WSGI type application, right? This is very similar in the ASGI portion of it. This is going to be like if we were running it, excuse me, asynchronous in this side. We can also have a settings file. This settings file, we're going to go back and reference quite a few times to set different values. So similar to us having a secret key inside of Flask, we need that inside of Django. This allows us to set up session cookies and things like that for our project. We also have allowed hosts, so we can tell it where it's going to be running. By default, debug equals true is up and running. So while we're coding and programming, it's going to give us a bunch of debug output. When you use this in production, you got to set debug equals false. And what that will do is turn off all of your 404 error pages and all that kind of stuff and actually publish the ones that you're looking for. We have an installed app section, a middleware section, a root folder. We have a whole templates directory. You'll note how it's already pulled in our templates directory inside of that. It'll tell us what WYSIWYG application that we want to use, or not WYSIWYG, but WSGI, sorry. And then you set up the database section. By default, Django is going to use SQLite 3, just like what we did with Flask, right? But the power behind Django is we don't have to code for a bunch of different databases and their styles. We literally just tell it what driver we want here. The rest of it is all handled through magic. It's not really magic, but it's really an abstract API that you write within Django in order to create all the different database syntax commands. So if you'll remember in Flaskar, we had to create a schema file. We don't even have to create that in Django. We use what's called a model system, and we'll talk about that model system. Outside of that, you got some password validation stuff, all default. And then down here at the bottom, you can set up your time zones, and you can set up whether or not you want I18N, which is going to talk about language type code. So we have it set up for English US by default. We give it a directory for our static. If you remember, static is where we put our CSS, JavaScripts, any kind of images, that kind of stuff. We are going to integrate this as well into Bootstrap, as Bootstrap's pretty common for doing our front end stuff. And then at the bottom, you have a big auto field. This is just going to set the primary key for this. So we're going to go in much more detail on settings, but at least you guys have an idea of where that's at. If you'll notice, when you start a project by default, a lot of times when you start this out, you come in a terminal and you would say something like Python manage.py start project, and then you would type in whatever the name of your project is. That's essentially what PyCharm did already for you. So we'll talk about those commands. Then you would have something like start app, and then you would create an application beyond that. We're going to do that here in just a little bit too. Next one over here is URLs, and we're going to talk about this. This is where you set up your URL configurations for the different pages that you're going to be working on. You'll also have what's called a views file, and we'll talk about the differences between URLs and views, and how we can import those in the different apps. And then last but not least is just the WSGI file. This is going to kind of set everything up. If you remember, we had to create all this to actually get it into production for Flask. Django creates it right off the scratch, right? And it creates all these files so that it's all set up and ready to go for production. All right. Again, I know I'm going to be covering this a little fast, so tell me to slow down if we're on a particular spot that you guys want to know about. It's quite warm in here, by the way. Okay, so as you want to see the different versions, as you'll see down here at the bottom, we actually have a file called Django admin. And so if we just type in Django admin, you'll start to see that we have a bunch of different tools and things that we can run with that. In this case, we would have something like Django admin start project my site. All right. In our case, PyCharm already created that for us. So it came in here and did Django admin start project, Django project 1 is what it ended up doing. That little script and routine generates all these files, the template structures for us, and the manage.py file. It just creates everything. Really, really handy. All right. You'll notice that Start Project created those files I just talked about. And you'll also see with a development server that we can just run Python manage server.py. So Python manage, manage.py run server. And that will go ahead and launch the web server just like we would have done within Flask. You'll see this here on this side. You can click on the website and you can see that the install works successfully, right? So we're up and running, port 8000 going on, all right? Debug equals true. That's why we saw that little error message or that little pop-up that came in there. You can go ahead and close this. You'll notice down here below, we still got the same front end, back end, where we're seeing the different gets and the requests that are coming in on our website. You can also hit the play button up here at the top, which essentially runs the same thing, and then you can go ahead and run it in here. So unlike Flask, where we had to go do a bunch of manipulation up in that configuration file, it just really works with PyCharm. All right. Anybody have any questions on getting their stuff handled and getting it set up? All right. If we look down here in the error code, you're going to see something like you have 18 unapplied migrations. Program won't work well for admin auth content type sessions. We have to run migrate. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. All right. Other things that you can have in here, when you run manage.py, by default, we're running on port 8000, and it's just running on 127.0.0.1. Does anybody remember what that IP address is? It is. It's just our loopback address on our individual port or a local host. And so therefore, we're only going to run on a port that's hosted with us. We're not hosting it out to the internet or where anybody off any machine on my local network can get access to it. If we just put 8080 in here, then we're going to actually have to pass in the IP address of whatever our host machine is, right? If we say quad zeros colon 8000, then we're all of a sudden going to run on every single Ethernet device on my laptop. So that could be my hardwire, it could be my wireless, everything. It's listening on all those interfaces, and we're going to be listening on port 8000. You can adjust that port as you see fit. So if you have a bunch of different things running locally on your system, you may need to adjust that port. Just like with Flask, as I make changes in any one of these files, there's constantly a monitor going on. So if it notices I made a change in, say, my settings or my manage or whatever inside of here, it's going to automatically restart for us. We don't have to stop the server and restart it. It automatically will do that for us. All right. So that's going to get us to where we're going to create a folder called, or a application called polls, right? Again, what's really slick about Python, and we're going to get into the admin side of things, but what I like is if I need to manage a bunch of users accessing some web application that I'm going through, it has this entire admin interface built out. It uses it exactly with your code. So it's really simple and easy to get an admin side of your page up and running. You don't have to make a bunch of code on the backside to figure this stuff out. In other words, you don't have to know a bunch of SQL. You don't have to know a bunch of writing permissions and this and that. It's actually all built in, and then you can pick what defaults you want with it. So it's really slick. A good example of this is I think I've used Hayland Farms a couple of times. So I'm going to just pull up this website. If I could spell Hayland Farms. What I do, not pay the bill. All right, pay the bill. Oh, HTTPS. Okay. I forgot I had to run it on web only, although I should have redirected, but purpose. Okay, so this was a real quick Django app that I threw up in order to get this particular farm up and running for an event that they had. So you could see just flat static HTML, but we also had a series of different pages. In our case, we wanted people to be able to sign up, right? So they had to get tickets, which allowed them to register with our system. So in this register, this, as you notice, it kind of blinked there a little bit when it took you to the register. This is an application specifically for the pilots. So the overall website would have been Hayland Farms. I had a specific application for pilot registration because we wanted to keep that separate than public, because there was a lot of other information we wanted to store about the pilots, right? And we were not charging them money for this kind of thing, so there's no integration for them to have to do any kind of exchange on money. There was another application for the public side. So in the general public, you could see they could come in here and buy adult tickets, child tickets, that kind of stuff. And all this can kind of be set up inside the admin side. So once you create these different items for sale, then we could turn around and build that out on the web page. If this is set up like a template, so as we just do a for loop for all the different items that we're selling, it just goes ahead and builds each one of these out, prints the price out and all that comments. Really slick and fast to build out fast websites. All right. This has a whole cart system. So there's this whole e-commerce app inside of this overall project, which allowed them to do e-commerce transactions, allowed them to go purchase tickets, set it all up and do that. Last but not least, there's another application that went ahead and allowed you to not only add a ticket like this, we could get it added to our cart. And if we go ahead and check out, we fill out some information here. Yes. Place our order, and then we can go ahead and check out with PayPal. So there's a whole PayPal integration along with this web app that allowed us to take payments on side of that. A lot of times there's PayPal for integration, there's Stripe for integration for those of you that built websites that need to take money. I encourage you to look at a bunch of the different players out there. You're going to pay different fees for every single player, right? So PayPal is really slick and easy because most people have PayPal, but at the same time, you're probably paying 3.5% on every transaction. Right? Stripe is going to bring down that percentage down to like 1.5, 2, depending on how you have it set up. But most people don't have a Stripe account, but it allows you to take credit cards in and you can safely enter in credit card information and get it entered to the website. So lots of different ways to build web apps that need to be able to take money. I'm not going to cover that in great detail in this class unless you need it for your project. And then I can kind of work with you to record a video on how we would do that. All right. So with our application here, we're going to use a command line called start polls. This is going to go ahead and create an application and generate all the files for us. So if we go to the start here and we do a Django admin and we say start app, and we're going to start app called polls in this case. And so when we hit enter, we click over here on this side and we'll see that we get a polls folder that shows up. So we click in the polls folder. You're going to have migrations. This is where it's going to store all of your database migrations. What's a migration? What's a migration look like? What that does is it will store anytime you make changes to the database in terms of structure, it will create incremental migrations all the way through. This will allow you to rebuild your project or reset your project or tell it what migration you want to run from. This also allows you, when you put it out to GitHub, if you want to go back and incrementally add features to a project, who wouldn't want to do that because you're never going to think of everything right off the bat, this will incrementally build that from scratch, right? So if you need to build a database because you checked out my project from GitHub, it will automatically build out the database as you need it set up, all the way to the latest and greatest version. Inside the command line, you'll run Django-admin start app polls, and this will create an application for you. Basically, generate this folder, create the migrations folder, and then all the files inside of it. Yeah, it doesn't. You have to kind of click sometimes for PyCharm to refresh. I've noticed that being a common thing. All right, so you'll notice those also have init.py, so it's bringing them in as modules. If we click on the admin page, this is going to set up the admin for our polls. We're going to go back into that in more detail, but we can register that. We have an apps folder or a file, I'm sorry, .py. This is going to list all the different applications that are inside of our particular project. And you'll notice that it's set up by default as the name of polls and how it sets up an auto field. Models, this is where we're going to create all of our entries in the database and how we map things together. So really long detail in models. We have a test file. This is where we can set up test case, kind of like what we saw in FlashStar, but I didn't go that fast, or not FlashStar, but Flask. We can set those up in here. And then last but not least is views. This is where you set up your different pages that you want to create, right? So if I want a page that goes /register / whatever, blah, 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 this is where I set that up. If you remember in Flask, they called it routes, right? We had app.route, and then we had to route wherever we wanted it to go. This is the whole routing system within Django. All right. So as we're moving through and we create that first view, just so we can see a page, if we go out to our views file, we're just going to do a side-by-side here so it's easy for everybody to see. We have this views, and at the top, move this over here. You'll see we have this from Django .shortcuts import render. There's a couple of different ones that we're going to use throughout this project. Right now, we're going to do an HTTP response. So we're going to use from Django.http import HTTP response. Notice how as I'm typing this, Django recognizes it and will tell us where to pull that in. So this one should come in. No. Oh, it's because I can't spell. There we go. And I can hit enter and it will go ahead and auto complete everything for me. All right. We're going to create our index, which if you guys remember on websites, that's usually, usually the first file that pulls up. So we have def index request. Note that every time we go to a page, we're passing in a request. This is going to have details like, what is our web browser? What is our client settings when we're coming from Google Chrome versus Internet Explorer, that kind of stuff. All of that is getting passed in to our web server with a bunch of information. If you guys haven't ever seen that before, we'll explore that. That will become important for those of you in cybersecurity. That's how we can tweak and do different things, is send false headers in to make it think that we're Internet Explorer when we're actually Google Chrome. Sometimes web servers will change their response to you based on what web browser you're using, right? So if I have really cool advanced features on my page, like Ajax and a bunch of other stuff, doesn't work real well in old school IE, right? So I turn all those features off when I present the page to you. I know you're coming from IE. I just disable all the Ajax cool functionality stuff and give you a plain Jane website. All right, so what we're going to do for now is we're just going to return a response, so HTTP response. And this is going to be our simple hello world, similar to what we did when we went with Flask. And we can say your at the polls index. Okay. Now this is where we're just returning flat text. Eventually we will return to an HTML page. We don't have that right now. When you do this inside PyCharm, you're going to end up getting this PEP 8 compliance. I encourage you to use PEP 8 compliance. All right. So what is PEP 8 compliance? That's just a golden standard for Python scripts in order for you to match code and that kind of stuff in there, right? In this case, it's expecting 2 blank lines before you start your code. So we just need one more enter, and notice how that line goes away. So when you're defining functions in PyCharm, if you go ahead and give it the 2 spaces, that's the de facto standard. Does PyCharm run with just one? Absolutely. But go ahead and clean up your code. That way you can refactor it and publish it. Same way here, you'll notice that you have a PEP 8 compliance because there's no new line at the end of the file. You just hit enter and all the code's ready to go. All right. A lot of people were texting me, or texting, but emailing me that they were keep getting squiggly marks under everything, right? That's why. Generally, it's a PEP 8 compliance. If it's a gray or a dark green one, it's a PEP 8. If it's red, then that means they can't figure out where you're going or what you're doing. All right. So now that we have that, we take a look back at our URLs page, right? So we have our index page here, and this is in our views file. This is where we're defining all the different routes that we're going to for this particular app. We need to add that back to our project URL so it has a clue where to go look for this stuff. So if we go back to our URLs file, back in our original polls, I'm sorry, not that URLs, but we need to create a URLs inside of our polls. So new Python file URLs. Okay. From here, we're going to go ahead and import Django.urls, import path. This is going to allow us to set up the path up to the overall project's URLs. So from there, we're also going to import everything from the views, which is, if you remember, our views.py file. And then we're going to set up a URL patterns. And inside this patterns, we're going to set up path views.index, and our name equals index. Okay, so what does this mean? URL patterns is where we're defining the pages that we want to go to, right? So in that path, you'll notice the first, does anybody remember what those are, what we pass into the path function? Arguments, so to speak, right? Passing in attributes. So the first one there, you'll notice, is just blank, right? We're just putting in 2 empty strings, which means when you go to the base page, this is going to be the page that comes up. So then we're linking that over to our views file. Yeah. We do have to create the URLs inside polls. You have the URLs for the outside project. We have to create one inside our polls folder. Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead. While she's doing that, I'm going to pause and check in. Sam, can you still hear me okay? Everything going all right?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's no problem. All right, let's pull this back up here. Okay. So again, we create this URLs file inside of our polls. We're going to enter in this default command. What this does is going to pull in our URLs so we can have this path functionality. And then we are saying bring in every defined thing inside of views. In this case, we're doing this so we have access to, go back to our views. Remember, we created this index one over here, right? I want to bring this over just a little bit more. All right. So this was in our views file. We created our index. We come over here to our URLs and we're going to say, if we go to just nothing, in other words, if I go to 127.001:8000, this is the page I want to serve. We are going to specifically point it to the function that we created for index. We're also going to name this index. So if I have any references to go to index later on, it's going to come back and match this URL pattern. All right. It's important to name these in a way that makes sense and is fluent as it goes through. Does that make sense? So if I name this index here, I don't want to name this zebra over here because it's going to be hard for you to follow as you go through. All right. Once we get that in there, we got to go back to our overall URLs and we need to tell it to go look inside of our app in order to find all the URLs there too. By default, you're going to see this admin one here. That should be there by default. We're going to ignore that for now. We're going to place an entry before that. And these are hierarchical. So you want to make sure you stick the stuff in the order at the top. So we're going to have path. Whoops. Path. And we're going to say, hey, look inside of our polls folder, right? And inside of our polls folder, we want to include any of our polls.urls. And a comment after that. Right. Notice how we do not have include here. We need to go back up to the top and do an import, which is actually here. And you'll notice we have Django URLs path. We also need to add include to include that functionality there. You'll notice once you add that, you can see everything moves out. All right. Anybody have any questions on that? So what this is saying is, hey, we have a subfolder down here called polls. Make sure you include all the URLs from that project as well.
Getting a squiggly red line under include.
Yeah, this squiggly one up here is basically coming up and saying, hey, the verb include doesn't fit. So it's trying to do grammar up here, and because we're defining a function up here, it doesn't.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean line 20.
Line.
Oh, because I didn't have include in line 17. Sorry.
Yes. So you'll initially have a red line. We'll have to come up here and do this import.
Yep.
Sorry if you didn't catch that part.
Got it.
All right. Once we have those URLs set up, we can go ahead and stop our server and we can restart because we made a bunch of changes there. You'll notice that everything came up. We still need to do apply migrations, and we'll talk about that once we get to the database side. But for now, we can click on 127.001, pull up our website, and we're going to get a page not found. Okay. Why did we get a page not found? Well, inside of our project, Django tried the URLs in this order, polls, and then admin, and the empty path didn't end up matching any one of those. Okay. So, whoops, back here. You'll notice that nothing came up there because we don't have anything on our outside project URLs. We just have it for our polls app. So if we go out to polls, now the index for our polls application pulls up as we would expect. This is our index. So you won't get anything out here on the outside for now because we've told it there are no pages out there, right? And if we put a whack admin out here, you'll see that we actually get a login. This is that other admin aspect that we were talking about before. And we'll talk about this a little bit here later. All right. Once we get that pulled in, a couple of notes over here on the path thing. So path, you have a couple of these arguments that you're going to pass in as to how you want to set that up. Those are all quarks, and you can pass this kind of stuff through. That's what it's talking about here. As you get more sophisticated in your URLs, a lot of times these URLs are going to be dynamic, right? Meaning that if you have a username, JL Zeller, and you want that to be part of the URL up here at the top, Then we're generating dynamic URLs on the fly. So there's a whole bunch of little code that we would have to build out in order to set those up. And we're actually going to do that here in a little bit when we create the polls. Exactly. It's basically going to append it to the end, and then it will tell you based on that being appended as to what route we pull up. Yep. All right. So for this database, we're just going to set up SQLite for SQLite 3, but notice there's a couple different engines that you can use with this. So we could set up a SQLite 3. We can use Postgre, which is what I use the most. We can use MySQL, and you can also use an Oracle backend there as well. There's also a ton more other backends if you want to use things like Mongo and a bunch of other ones. Mongo doesn't work as well, but it's mostly SQL-based ones. You can use any of these other databases in here. Okay. All of these are ORM-related type features within Django. You guys, if you don't know what ORM is, it's your object relational model that goes through it. Okay. All right. So we're going to go back. We're going to talk about our databases. By default, if you remember when we create a database, when we first do that, you just type create database and then a name inside of it, right? That's what our schema did. If you go back and look at our Flask project, that's what our schema did. Our settings file is going to be creating that automatically as well. All right. This is on the installed apps. So if you notice over here by default, we have a couple different apps that are installed with Django itself. We have the Django admin side. We have an auth for an authentication system. It's built into Django. You don't have to write your own, but you need to build different applications with it. You have a content framework, session framework, a messages framework, and a framework for managing static files. All right. When you set up a database, right now you'll notice that we have no database, right? Look in here, we have this guy here, which is created by default. If we double click on it, you'll know that we don't have anything here, but if we look at the database and we go ahead and connect to this data source, let's see here, data source is going to be a SQLite. And inside this, for the file, we're going to click on the 3 files here. Let's try to create another one. Cancel that. Let's see here.
It needs the, I think it may need the driver at the bottom.
Yeah, once we get it pulled up here, we can install the driver. So there we can go to our Django project 1, and then we can click on our DB3. And that's going to point out to our file so that we can modify it. Notice that we're missing the SQLite 3 driver in order to really modify and test these connections. Simply click download, it'll grab the drivers. We can test it. And you'll see that we're able to connect over here and do just fine, right? Remember, a SQLite database is just a flat file that's over here on this database, so to speak. We're not running a true database server at this point. So we hit apply and we hit OK. We can say OK, because now it's going to show us the schema for this. And you'll notice inside of here on server objects, you just have this up. So there is no database created at this point. We have a database, but we don't have any tables or anything like that running inside of our file. That is what our migrate's going to do. So if we come back out here to our terminal and we type in the Python manage.py migrate, and you're going to see all these little files that end up getting created. So you're going to see ones like content type, auth, all of the admin stuff to initially set up the admin pages. You're going to see a bunch of other auth verifications, and then you also have a session table as well. This is where we're going to store a bunch of information for your application so that we can use it. If we go out here and look now, we refresh this, you should see tables. You're going to notice we have 12 tables right off the bat. Yeah. If you click on database over here on the right-hand side, and it'll pop out that little slider, and then you have to set up the database connection up here at the top. So if you click on data source properties, and then go point to that file that was created, db.sqlite3. It should be in your project folder. So this will let you see your tables, and then you can see all your different keys, and all of this is already a schema that's basically set up for the default to run your Django application. Anybody have any questions on how migrate works? The only time you have to use migrate is after you set up models or you're adjusting that kind of stuff. If you're adjusting views and that kind of stuff, that doesn't matter. You're not really changing the database at that point. It's only where you're storing information do we have to do that. Once you run this migrations command down here at the bottom, then under the main, you should see tables come up. You may have to click this refresh button up here at the top. And then you could see or should see everything below that. All right. And again, this is just setting up all the defaults for Django itself. All right. And if you're over here on this console, this is a direct connection over to the database. So if we say show tables, and then run, oh, come on. It should pop up over there when you double click on it. So if you double click on this database connection over here on the left, on the actual file, it should pop up with a console for you. And so if we do something like select star from, say, auth group or auth permission, and hit enter, and then run, it's going to run that command against the SQL database, which in this case is just going to show us all the information that is in the auth permission table. And we can see in here, we have a bunch of different entries on how you change permissions, add things, remove things, set up sessions, that kind of stuff. Yeah, this is nothing that we create, but we're about to create our own session of that. But the reason I'm showing you this is a great way to run debug against models and things that we're about to set up. You can see what's in your database. So this database here is just going to show you your table structure. You can then run a console command against it to see what's actually in the database. All right, we'll close the console for now. What we're going to now go through is set up our models. It'll be the last thing that we do here today. So I'm going to close a few of these files. We don't have a bunch of things up. And if we go to our models.py, remember that models.py is again under our polls folder. We should have a models.py inside of there. All right. A model itself is basically a single definitive source of information about your data. All right. What does that mean? It's going to contain all the essential fields and the behaviors of the data that you're storing. Django follows a DRY principle. So what is a DRY principle? It means don't repeat yourself. All right. This is every distinct concept and or a piece of data should live in one and only one place. Redundancy is bad. Normalization is good. All right. The framework by default then within reason should deduce as much as possible from as little as possible. Does anybody have any idea what that just said? The idea is keep everything small and concise about whatever you're storing. Don't be storing a bunch of extra information that you don't really need. All right. So make your models as clean, you make your fields as clean as you possibly can, and you describe them as clean as you can. Meaning don't make everything a text field, make things integer fields if they're integer fields. If they're positive only integer fields, make them positive only integer fields. All right. So in this case, we're going to create a models.py, which we have here, and we are wanting to set up two classes. We're going to set up a question and a choice. All right. A question has a question and a publication date. A choice is going to have a choice of two fields, either the text of the choice and a vote tally. Right. So each choice is associated with a question. So we ask a question, you're going to have maybe one, maybe four choices based on that question. Every one of those questions is going to have a field of text and whether or not you voted for it. Right. So to build out that model, this is essentially how we build out our schemas only we don't have to build it out. We just build it out in this fashion. The schema will get generated automatically for us. So we are going to say our class of question. This is a models.model. Notice that's a capital N here for a model. There we go. And we're going to have a item in there called question text. And we are going to set that to our models.char field. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can put text inside of here. And you guys want to get familiar with how to set up models and do that. So if I come out here, let me blow this up so I can show you where I'm looking at. Go here. And if you look at the documentation for models, right, they're going to show you all these different references and things that you can do inside of it. There's a lot you can do in models. There's ways to validate and clean up text. We'll talk about that a little later. What I want you to see in the documentation is the different type of keys that you can set up. So give me a section here, find the right one. Okay, so when we first set up models, there's a bunch of different field types. And this is our field reference. So we can set it up as a null field, meaning that it's not going to store any data. You don't want to use null for things like char fields or text fields, right? We have a blank, which is just going to set up a blank field inside of our database. We have a set of choices we can set up inside of our model. But what we're really after are all those specific, there we go. Table, let me get past these and I'll explain it a little more. All right, so here's our types. We have autofield, which is going to try to automatically adjust whatever we want. Don't want to use that very much. It's just an integer field. We have a big autofield. This is going to handle a, let's just go to big integer field. There we go. So this can handle up to a 64-bit integer, meaning it's going to range any number from this on the negative side to this on the positive side. All right. Yeah. Yes. Yep. That's one way to use it. Yep. So let's see here. You can also, the default form widget for this is a number input. So what's cool about this is if you set your database up the proper way, when you build out a form or a Django form, it's going to go, oh, you have a big integer field. You want this type of widget in order to display this. Meaning if I have a text box, it's going to give a text box on the website. If I have a small entry field, then it won't give me a full text box. It's just going to give me a character that limits me at 255 characters, things like that. So the more precise you are on the type of fields you set up, it will automatically generate form data and a bunch of other cool stuff for you. All right. So widgets, these are going to be things like an email. So if you tell it it's an email, or you tell it's a password, or you tell it what it is, it's going to store it and then do protections on top of that because you stored it in that type. Binary, obviously we can set that as a binary to store binary data. Boolean, those are just like true and false. If you guys remember that from Python 360. You could automatically have this set up as a checkbox, right? So it's going to be a checkbox. It's either checked or not checked. Char field, this is going to allow us to do a string field for small to large size strings. Remember, if we're doing large amounts of text, we'll use a text field. That will go ahead and use a text input for us. Date fields, you can set up date time fields, decimal fields, duration. There's a ton of these inside of here, which means when you're setting up all these, you may start out as text strings, but as you conceptually think about what kind of data you're storing, you want to set them to the proper type. If you set it to a file path, it's going to store it in the right file path kind of structure. Yeah. No. Yes, you can. So there's, when you actually set these up, you can actually say, okay, a float field is going to be this big if I use the big integer, right? But I can actually limit that to only have 10 character input. So you can adjust the rules that are there by default. So for the model field, when we were setting up here with question, we are just going to set up a char field. And for example, we are saying the max length of this char field is 200 characters. That means that the user can't type in more than 200 characters to store this in the database. So when we set up our widget that comes up in our form, it's immediately capped at 200 characters because that's how we set it up in the database. Note that we are not writing SQL text here, right? So this will work on whether we use SQLite 3, whether we use Postgre, whether we use Microsoft SQL Server. It will automatically generate the correct SQL command to generate that in the database. All right. The next one we're going to create is our pub date. And this allows us to use models.datetime. This allows us to store date time field. Notice there's a difference between date field and date time field, right? Date field just stores the date. Date time is going to store the date and the time that it was accessed. And in this date time field, we are just going to use this as reference text of date published. Okay. Then we're going to create another class called choice. We have our models.model. We are going to have a question, obviously, that's associated with this particular choice. So remember, we create a question, then we're going to have a bunch of choices based on that question, right? So here we're going to create a foreign key, which ties it back to our question that we created up above. And if we delete this choice, we could say on delete equals models.cascade. What this means is if we end up deleting this foreign key, I think I spelled that wrong, maybe. Oh, we have to import a foreign key. Give me a second. If you spell it correctly, you do not. Oh. I sometimes cheat and just don't import models. I import everything. Don't do that. Do it the right way. Okay, so there's our foreign key question and on delete cascade. Again, the on delete cascade portion of this is going to delete every single one of these that are down below. So we do a cleanup when we delete. Okay. We have a choice text, models.char field. And in this one, we're also going to have a max length of 200. And so if I go look up char field over here, when I was looking at the model reference, for example, if I come back up here to char field, there we go. And on char field, I can pass in max length along with other options. So maybe we do a DB correlation. It's not that we're worried about, we're just worried about max length. What that will do is enforce it at the database level, but it also enforces it in our Django forms when we fill out a website. All right. Now that we have that one, the last one is our votes. And then we're going to store this on a models.integer field. Notice that there's a bunch of different integer fields out there, right? So if I do integer, you're going to see something like integer choices, positive integer field, big, small, comma separated, big, positive, positive, small, that kind of thing, right? In theory, this should actually be a positive integer field, not just an integer field, right? Our votes are never going to go negative. We can't vote negative. So in theory, this should have went to a positive integer field, but we're just going to set it up as we did in the tutorial as a integer field. And we're going to set the default value of this to 0 right off the bat. All right. Some of these are going to have values that you pass in like max length. Some of these are going to have a default value that you can set up initially in the database. Anybody have any questions on how models work? So for every choice, it has to be associated with some question. Not every question is associated with every single choice. In other words, we can have 400 choices in here because we have 40 questions, 10 choices to each question. Yeah. You could set up you can set up whatever you want in there, right? Just set it to null. So a lot of times if you're setting this up and you're not sure if you want it yet, you could set it to null so that it doesn't put anything in the database upon that entry. It will just leave that section blank, and then you could go back later and wipe all of those. But you kind of want to add just a little pieces of the puzzle at a time. That's the purpose of migrations, is that you don't want to try to think of every single field that you could possibly do at once. You want to get as much as you can in the first one, but but as you make changes, you're fine. Because what's going to happen is if you have a bunch of information in your database and you add a new field like account name, going back to that, it has to have some default value to put for all the entries that already had account name in there. All right. Which is where I've run into the most troubles. I come up with a lot of cool features and I'm like, oh, I need to go back and add this. And then I got to set some kind of default for everything and then go tweak it for every one of those. All right. Now that we have these models in here, we can go ahead and save this file. We need to import those into our settings file to tell them that, hey, we have this application. So if we go back to our settings.py, and if we go down to installed apps, which we have here, we need to add polls. And you want to make sure that we put polls up at the very top. Okay. Again, every one of these is imported in order. So we want to put all of our new apps at the very top. So polls.apps.polls config. Okay. And what polls config is going to plug in everything that we pulled out of our models that we just created. So polls.config is automatically generated inside of that. Okay. Once that's in, if we go out here to our, close some of this down here, we go out to our terminal. Now, this time, instead of migrations, we're going to do what's called make migrations. And what that's going to do is create all the different ones inside of that. Whoops, did I not set that right? Spelled that. Give me a second. Polls.apps.polls config. Should automatically work unless I set up something wrong there. Yeah. This is kind of a new feature here. Is this polls config? Is in the apps.py. All right, give me a second here. Let's go back to apps.py. Yeah, here was our polls config, and that was all set up by default. Oh. I probably didn't import it. Import? No. Polls. Oh, comment. Believe it or not, it's a comment again. Okay, it's Python. This stuff will drive you nuts until you figure this stuff out. I've done it enough times. That's how I recognize it. So simple comma will end up breaking this kind of stuff if you don't set it up right. Okay, this is why I get to make the mistakes. All right, so we rerun it and bingo, bango, it created those. All right. If we look inside of these, we'll see an initial.py file creating the model question and the model.choice. So what happened there? If we go up here to migrations, you'll see that we now have this Python file here. And if we look at that Python file, it's automatically generated by Django. It's going to create this class called a migration. It's telling us all the SQL information that we need to go ahead and create this at. Notice that some of these we didn't set values like that too, right? So for example, there's this ID field. We never created an ID field. That's generated by default for Django for a primary key. All right. If you're trying to remember how this primary key got set up, if you'll remember when we go back to our apps, there you go. Default auto field of big auto field. All right. Anyway, what this does in this migrations table is that it's basically setting up the SQL database side of it. So if we go back and look at our SQL database, as of right now, and we refresh, these are our tables. Notice that we don't have a question table or a choice table at this point. We actually have to do the migrate in order to execute those commands, right? So we can say here, if we wanted to do one at a time, we could do something like Python manage.py SQL migrate polls 001. And what this does is it actually generates, this would generate your database schema that you guys would have created if you did it from scratch, right? So if we look, we have something like create a table, insert into there, what the different choices are, all that kind of stuff. We don't have to run that specifically. All we have to do is do something like Python manage.py, and you can do a check. What check is going to do is make sure that there's no issues, meaning that you forgot to run make migrations, you forgot to run migrate, etc. So you want to know whether or not that check passes every time. Right? If that check passes, go ahead and run your migrate. And you'll notice that we applied the migrations to all these different fields, including polls. And now if we were to look at our database and we refresh our tables, notice how two more pop up here. It calls polls, and then we have a choice and a polls question. So it always does it with the app name and then underscore whatever your model that you created. If we look inside choice and we look at our keys, we see one key. If we look at our columns, you can see the fields that we created. Choice text and votes. It also has a foreign key back to the question that we created the first time. Right. Anybody have any questions on that part? So we now have our database all set up. We can use our shell here. There's a couple different things that we can do from the command line. This will allow us to play and get information out of the database without having to do it in Python. And it will do it in such a way that you can use the API directly with Django. So if we say Python manage.py shell, this is going to put us in a Django shell. From here, we can say from polls.models, import choice and question, right? And then we can say question.objects.all. This will return everything that was in the database into essentially a dictionary. Then we can deal with it in Django, right? So instead of us having to say select blah, blah, blah from the database, we don't have to do that. We write this with the API that's built into Django. And we'll go into much more detail on that here later on. But this is a good way for you to be able to pull out questions, add questions to the database, do a bunch of different items inside of that. So in order to create a question, if we go back here to our keys, or sorry, to our question, remember that we had three columns. We had question text and we had pub date, right? Well, in order for us to do a pub date, it requires a date time. So we need to import date time. So from Django.utils, import time zone. That's going to help us set up our date time. Then we can say Q, and a lot of times you'll get this when you build out your Django code. You're going to just set up a single character variable inside of your project. So Q equals question. And inside this, we are going to create a question that has a question text equal to what's new. And we need to pass in our pub date equal to our time zone dot now. And that's just a function that grabs our current time. I hit enter. Now I've created this question, but I have not saved it to the database. And so you guys, anytime you're using this, you want to make sure you call .save so that it's in the database. And we can test that real quick. We come up here to our SQL, which we have full screen. Let's close our database. We have our SQL. If we do select all from question, in this case, it'll be polls question. Right? And we run this. Notice how nothing comes back, right? We have no entries into our database for that. So until we hit .save, will we have anything come back? So we say q.save. At that point, Q is a what? When we say Q equals question, what was it? Sorry, Sam.
Question.
It's a question, but what is it as in reference to Python?
An object?
It's an object. You're right. You're defining this question object at this point. So because we created this as an object, we can say type Q, and you'll notice we get back a class of polls models question, which means we have a question object now inside Python, which means we can do different methods on it. In this case, q.save, and we want to save that to the database. Right? Now that we saved it to the database, we can say q.id. That's going to return whatever ID is in the database for that. If we say q.question_text, it's going to show us back the text for that question. We can say q.pubdate. That's going to give us back the date timestamp that's inside of there. If we pass that date timestamp into Python's date time, we could have that formatted the way we want it in there. All right. If we want to modify something in here, now that we've already made that entry into the database, we could say something like q question_text equals what is up. Let's just change it a little bit from the test. We'll do a question. Remember, we still have to do q.save, and that will go ahead and save it to the database. If we're inside of our project, we use this select all, in this case, select asterisk from pulse question. We hit play. Notice that our question pops up down here at the bottom, right? This allows you to see whatever's in your database within PyCharm, but Django also has this built in. So instead of doing select all from there, we can do this from the terminal and say something like, let's see here, sorry. I messed this up.
Questions at object.all.
Yeah. So question dot objects dot all, and you'll notice I will get back a query set, in this case a list of all the different entries in the database. And so I could say for question dot objects dot all. I forgot the word question, didn't I? Yep. For question and question dot objects dot all. Print q dot update. And we go ahead and print each one of those out. Now it's not going to do it here because I didn't have my for loop quite set up with tabs and all that because I'm in the command line, but we could do stuff like that, right? We could also filter out when we do our lookup. So if we do question.objects.filter, we can say, I want the one with an ID of 1, and it will return back that object for me. If I could spell correctly, objects, we would get that back. And if I could spell question, that's what happens when I type fast. Notice how we get that object back. If I assign that to something, say I assign that to JSON equals question.objects.filter ID equals 1. Having a tough time spelling. Here we go. If I look at JSON, JSON is an object. I can look at JSON.pubdate, and I would get back the pubdate for that. Should get that back. Oh, it's going to be the first one. It came back as a list, right? So I need to set up JSON 0 update. There you go. And I can see I get the date back. So when you do a query for one and you even filter it as an ID of 1, you're still getting back a list. You can also do a search for question text underscore starts with what. You're going to pull back all the results that start with what, right? This is you manually interacting with the API. When you build this out in code, which we're going to do here in a little bit, you would use these same type of filters in order to set that up. If you want drop downs at the top of your cool web app to filter this kind of stuff out, right? Filter by price, sort highest to lowest. We can set up those type of filters inside of the database in order to pull that information. All right. We'll catch back up here with this integration here in a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and set you up with a Django admin so you can understand how the admin part works. So right now we're having to manually enter in all these different questions and all the different choices. That's a pain doing that through the terminal. We can actually do that through the Django admin, which is a GUI interface to your own web app. All right. We will see you on Thursday. For now, if you want, because we're working on this project, you can go ahead and put it out on GitHub if you want. I'm going to mark this one as a private one and just go ahead and send it up to my GitHub and save our changes and commit what we have currently. When you do a commit, just remember you don't want to submit your idea. We'll end up creating a get-ignore file for that. We'll go ahead and submit all of your migrations, everything inside of it. The only thing we won't submit is our database at this point. So we'll hit add, and we'll push it on up to GitHub, and then we can do a push, and we're good to go. Now, you could store your database for the time being, but usually when you're building these Django apps, you don't want to shove all your database stuff up, unless it's things that should be in the database from the point they created your application, right? So if you're sharing your application out with people and they should have this minimum amount set up in the database, then we have to go up and set that to automatically put that in the database. All right, we'll see you on Thursday.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Sam.